Apologies for the late start. There was another talk on before us and we didn't like to rush them out. And then we were expecting a good crowd, but we weren't expecting a huge crowd. So anyway, you're all very, very welcome. And most welcome of all is Tadhg, who is coming back to us for the third time, which tells you how popular he is in County Tipperary. And he was telling us earlier on there that his son is now being coached hurling by a Tipperary man. So he's almost a Tipperary man himself. Anyway, without any further ado, I hand you over to Tadhg, and I can guarantee you're in for a very, very enjoyable evening.
Thank you very much, Mary. Does that sound okay? Okay, it sounds weird to me. So I would have got to get the lights killed. Oh, no, that's okay.
The picture proves more than the picture. It's a picture. Believe that.
I'll just talk away. First of all, thank you to Mary, and thank you to the organisers of the series for asking me to talk at this. Sorry, I'm not used to microphones at all. I tend to bellow the side of the pitch, sometimes in the classroom. So this is unusual. I'm hearing myself as if I'm listening to someone else talk, and I'm quite disconcerted to know what that other person is going to say. So bear with me. No, I'm delighted to be here. I hadn't realised it is 3 times, and I'm always pleased to accept an invitation. I always like coming down the country. I always feel I'm going home, although I'm Dublin born. My heart is very much down here. My father was from North Cork, and going down to Cork as a kid, as soon as you saw the Rock of Cashel, you thought home. It's a very, very special moment. So I'm very close to this place. And of course, I spent a lot of time in Feathered, which I loved. And I've spent a lot of time in Tipperary. It's one of the great counties. I actually think if you're a medievalist like I am, if you do medieval buildings like I do, you could spend an entire life in 2 counties, Limerick and Tip. Between the 2 of them, they've just about got everything. And the last of all Ireland's the hurling coach, by the way, is, you may have heard some guy called Nicky English. Sound familiar? Yeah. And you know, I would give up all of this to have an All-Ireland medal myself. It never happened, but I keep encouraging my young lad, come on, win one for your old dad. We'll see. Anyway, excuse me, I'm also recovering from a head cold, so I may cough a bit. When I was invited to do this talk, I thought, well, why not Athassel Priory? It's one of the greatest monuments we have from the Middle Ages in Ireland, anywhere in the country. It's a fantastic monument. It's not well known. It's kind of a known unknown, if you know what I mean, to borrow sort of Don Roosevelt speak. Everyone knows about it, but nobody knows much about it. It's never had a proper architectural study done. It's never had a proper historical study done. It's begging for one to be done. Last year, I was asked by Coleman O'Clawby, who I'm sure you know very well, of Glenstall. Coleman is a great old friend of mine, and he asked me to write a paper for this book on Augustinian Canons Regular, and I offered a paper on cross-shaped churches, transeptal churches, of which this is one. And I came down to Athassel, and I spent a part of a day rooting around, trying to make sense of it. And I think I did. I have a series of ideas about it, some of which I'll give to you today. And while I might be right, sometimes by being wrong, you find how you can be right. So, as I always say to students, if you're afraid of being wrong, don't be an academic. That's the one great crime if you're an academic. If you're gripped by fear of rejection of what you say, then go and do something else. So I'm not afraid of being wrong about Athassel. I think what I've got is a sequence for the building, an understanding of the building, which I think now needs to be tested. So what I'm going to do today is, my plan this evening, I'm going to introduce the priory's history, fairly briefly. Each section will be about 10 minutes or so. Then I want to talk about the nature of the order of regular canons of St. Augustine. Now, who are these people? Who are the clerics that were in Athassel Priory in the Middle Ages? Where did they come from? What was their routine? And why Augustinian and not something else? I want to talk about the introduction of Gothic architecture to Ireland because it's an early example of Gothic. So I want to put it in the context of Irish architectural history. Is it near the start? Is it halfway through the introductory phase? Where does it sit? How would we describe it? And then finally, I want to present a new architectural history of the Athassel. Actually, yes, the Athassel sounds appropriate. I want to give you a version of the sequence of the building. The paper itself will be published shortly, I think this month or next month, and the library will probably get the book and you can read a longer version of it there. It's about 5,000 words on Athassel. So this is what I'm going to do today, basically. First of all, the history of Athassel. Here's a great aerial photograph, probably taken last summer when the ground was very, very parched. And you can see how extensive this is. This is one of the most extensive, possibly the most extensive medieval monastic ruin that we have in Ireland. What do we know about its foundation? The problem with Athassel is that it's not particularly well recorded. And this is one of the very curious things about it. You would imagine that a medieval monastery of its size, of its opulence, would be very comprehensively recorded, and yet it isn't. It's often described as having been founded circa 1200, which always struck me as very early for it. Early in the sense that the Anglo-Norman invaders are only here about 30 years. Tipperary is only being settled as a region in the 1190s and early 1200s. So, you wouldn't imagine that they would feel comfortable enough to build something of this scale, or to think of building something of this scale so early on. And also, its architecture, a lot of its features, look to be a little bit later. So when I turned set my crosshairs on Athassel last summer, I was expecting not to accept the date of circa 1200, but actually the date is correct. It's founded circa 1200, so it's a very early foundation. And before I tell you about the circumstances of foundation, so far as I can, let me just sort of contextualize that a little bit. We do tend to think of the Anglo-Norman invasion as being a military invasion, and it was, for the most part, a military exercise. But we also need to recall, I think, or remember that the Ireland into which the invaders came was an Ireland which was already outward-looking. It was already very European in its ways, including in its church organisation. So the Anglo-Normans didn't need to invent things when they came here. They came into an island which was ready for them, and they represented, as I think I probably said here before, effectively a change of government. So we probably shouldn't be too surprised to find that within a generation they're in a position to stop worrying about bows and arrows and start building big churches. They often went to brand new sites, places which hadn't significant settlement earlier, so that they didn't need to sort of negotiate what's already on the ground. So they picked places where there was an opportunity to build a big abbey or a big priory, a local water resource, land that could be settled and farmed, space for settlement, etc. The site of Athassel absolutely filled those requirements. And another factor in its foundation is its proximity to Cashel, which I'll touch on in just a moment. We don't have any foundation charter, and this is our big loss. When these places are founded, there's a charter created for the foundation. What the charter does basically is it spells out the legal permissions and constraints. So normally a medieval charter of foundation will say, you know, I blah blah blah, hereby blah 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 to the monks of blah blah blah, in perpetuity for the souls of my wife, my father, my mother, my heirs. In other words, I'm giving you the land, guys, and you're going to pray for us when we're gone. So that's the compensation. You get to go to the monastery, we get to go to heaven. And that's how it works, basically. And then what it does is it spells out how it's going to be funded. The patron will say in the charter that, you know, you'll have that the community will have access to the weir on the river shore, to the mill by the something, etc., etc., etc. So these are actual resources, sort of monetarily realised resources, and we call them temporalities. But it'll also say perhaps that you will get the income of parishes. I might even list parishes. We call them spiritualities. And these two things are kind of the economic bedrock on which the monastery then exists. Unfortunately, charters often don't survive. They sometimes survive in later copies. So at some stage, somebody needs a copy of the charter, and instead of going to the local, you know, printer or the photocopier, it's written out again. So we often have copies, but not the originals. And the copies are authentic; they are accurate copies. We don't have it here, so we're missing a whole significant part of the story of the foundation. And that's one of the reasons why there's always been this doubt about when Athassel was founded. We have one actual story of its foundation, and this is it. I don't know if you can read this. It's in Latin. This is from a manuscript in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It dates from the year 1377, so it's, you know, it's 170 years later. And what it says, translated, is around the year of our Lord 1182, the Lord William de Burgo, who is the son of the Count of Canterbury, founded a monastery of the canonicum of the Nigrorum, of the Black Canons. And of course the Augustinians were known as the Black Canons because of their garb. The Cistercians were called white monks by the same token. In the territory of Athassel in Ireland, in honour, and this is really interesting, of Saint Mary and Saint Edmund, King and Martyr. So here is a record from the middle of the 14th century which tells us that around the year 1182, William de Burgh, who's part of the great Burke family line, eventually to become Earls of Ulster and so on, one of the great families of the Middle Ages, that he founds the monastery for Augustinian canons in Athassel, and the dedication is to St. Mary, the BVM, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and St. Edmund, Edmund the King and the Martyr. It's a very interesting record. It's wrong in one important sense, and the sort of it's wrong in a way that makes you slightly nervous, because William de Burgh wasn't in Ireland in 1182. He didn't come for another 3 years when he came with Prince John, so that's wrong. But although it's got the date wrong, and remember, these guys are not worrying about the history the way we would. It was William de Burgh, that is correct. So I think we can just accept that they got the date incorrect. And the reason we know it is William de Burgh is that in the first decade of the 13th century, William is already collecting the economic resources which are going to help fund the monastery. And if he hadn't already founded the monastery, he wouldn't be collecting these resources. So the first line is fine, apart from the date. What I should have said was around the year 1200. And it is around the year 1200. William de Burgh founds the monastery of Black Canons in territory of Athassel in honour of St. Mary and St. Edmund. And this is quite interesting, because later on in the Middle Ages there's some confusion about the actual dedication of the priory. And this is an unusual pairing, but I think this is the correct pairing. Dedications to the Blessed Virgin Mary are not uncommon, very common in the Middle Ages with the Anglo-Normans. St. Edmund is the peculiar one. St. Edmund was an Anglo-Saxon king who was martyred. He's a Christian Anglo-Saxon king, which means he's pre-Anglo-Norman. He's not like one of the regular saints whom the Anglo-Normans would have venerated. He belongs to the people in England whom they clobbered, like sort of, St. Patrick or something. So he's an unusual dedication. There was a chapel dedicated to St. Edmund in Dublin, in Christ Church Cathedral, probably around the same time. And my guess is that, this is correct, number one, and that number two, we're looking at an attempt to create a cult of St. Edmund in Ireland. So two foundations dedicated to St. Edmund. Why William de Burgh chose him, particularly because there are other possible saints around whom you could have a cult, it's hard to know, but I have a suggestion. When Athassel is founded, it's not long since Thomas Becket was murdered in Canterbury, and of course, son of the Count of Canterbury. Becket, of whom you have to say he wasn't a particularly nice man. I mean, you read about him and you realise he deserved to be killed, but maybe impeached or something. I don't know. But Becket, as soon as he is killed and he's martyred, he goes from being a complete pain in the ass, basically, to being this incredibly important Christian figure. So he's reinvented. Death is a great career move, and it is for Becket. So there's this awareness of martyrs. The martyred king may have something to do with Cashel up the road, in that this is very close to the royal centre of Cashel, where someone like Cormac McCarthy has already sort of been balanced between being a king and being a slightly sanctified figure. There's an awareness in the Cashel hinterland of what a saintly king means.
So when you mentioned the name of the man you just said was murdered, I'm just hearing it as a slight muffle.
Thomas Becket.
Who?
Becket.
Oh.
Thomas Becket, murder in the cathedral. And Henry II was responsible for Becket being killed. He never admitted it. It's very Trumpian. He said, nothing to do with me, but everyone knew he was. He was excommunicated for it, and eventually he found his way back into the embrace of the church. So choosing a martyred king was a good idea down here. I suspect William had also observed how the Abbey of St. Thomas up in Dublin was getting incredibly rich on the basis of having the association with a martyr, and probably thought, if I can have an equivalent down here, I can have something similar. I'm not going to go for Thomas Becket, I don't have a family connection, but there is a family connection with the St. Edmund story. So I think that's what's going on here. What I'm saying in a very poor roundabout way is that this has been thought out, basically. The same source that we have also tells us a legend, which is not to be believed, but is a fascinating legend. It says that the priory of Athassel has an image of St. Edmund. It doesn't say what type of image. It could be a sculpture, I suspect it's a painting. And in the image, Edmund holds a lance. And when a descendant of William de Burgh, the head of the family line, is approaching death, is in proximity to death, Edmund throws the lance onto the floor of the church. So it's a very interesting tradition, the throwing of the lance onto the floor of the church, like a banshee, to indicate that there's going to be a death in the family. Whatever the source of this, it's fairly correct. They've got the date wrong a little bit, but that's all that they've got wrong. So around 1200 it's founded, which means not only is money being diverted into building the buildings that you see today, but resources are being collected, farms are being laid out, rights to fish and weirs, etc. are all being sorted out to fund this great project. A fair is granted in 1224, which is an important event. The fair is almost certainly within the precinct, somewhere there on the right-hand side. What a fair does is it indicates that there's going to be a settlement. The convention was to give the right to hold a market first, and then once you've given permission for a fair or a market, you then follow through by bringing in settlers. And we do know that this was a borough, this was a settlement later on. So the grant of fair in 1224 tells us that this was not a settlement before 1224. 1224 was the first shot in developing an actual settlement at Athassel. It gets burned later on, and of course it's all completely gone now. Sorry, wrong way. It became the burial place for the Burke family. This was their favoured burial place, and this is recorded. Sir James Ware, who's a very important source, is one of the people who said it was founded around 1200. Ware was writing in the 17th century, but he collected medieval documents, and because you don't have the originals, you always need to be very cautious. But Ware tells us that Walter de Burgh was buried there in 1271, and we know that from other sources as well. It does make you think that Ware probably did see actual documents. He may even have seen the foundation charter, and it's now gone. But the burial of the head of the Burgh family through the Middle Ages is a real sign of the importance of this place. It's attacked in the early 14th century. Probably lots of attacks on this, but this was a particularly important attack, and I think this is probably the first moment when the future of the monastery is being challenged, and they're aware themselves that this is going to stay here forever. I think there's a tension around the place thereafter. The vulnerability of the community is now apparent. Oops, sorry, gone too fast. Walter Burgh, I meant Richard de Burgh, the Earl of Ulster, is buried there in 1326. And he's the great Earl of Ulster. He's one of the greatest landowners of the Middle Ages. So even though the Burgh family is further up the country, even though they are the Earls of Ulster, they go back off down here to Athassel for burial. Various priors of Athassel, various heads of the community through the Middle Ages had the name Edmund. So it's got this interesting dedication, St. Edmund and St. Mary. We know its dates, we could do with a lot more knowledge. We've very tantalising information about the end of the monastery. In 1484, it's recorded that the canons, quote, live in private habitations and not in the monastery, and that divine worship is almost extinct in the church of the monastery, the buildings of which are in need of no little repair. So by the end of the 15th century, the decline, which I think starts in the early 14th century, has now reached a stage where basically the place is abandoned. And 2 years later, the monastic observance effectively ends because a lay administrator is put in charge of it. So it's passed over to the care of someone who's not a member of the order, just to keep it up and running to some degree. And what that lay administrator did, we don't know. We just know one was appointed. So, conventional wisdom would be that a place like Athassel was dissolved when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. And yes, that's exactly what happened. But most historians will tell you that by the time the monasteries are dissolved by Henry VIII, most of them are already heavily impoverished, largely abandoned, and Athassel was pretty much abandoned. There wasn't a lot to dissolve at Athassel. So this magnificent complex had, had a short enough history and has a poor historical record given what is there today. To know more about Athassel really requires us to look at the buildings. What do the buildings tell us about the place? Let me talk about the Augustinian canons regular. Who are these people? There are a lot of monastic orders which could have been given occupancy of Athassel. You imagine you're William de Burgh and you're thinking, I want to build a monastery. I want there to be monks or canons or somebody on my land who will pray for me forever. Who will I go to? Cistercians are one option, but the Cistercians are a difficult option in the sense that they require an awful lot of land, but they're not terribly generous. So they do a lot of praying for you, but they're distant and remote. The Augustinians were much better for this, so the Augustinians were favoured. And the Augustinians were happy with more limited resources. So William de Burgh didn't have to worry too much about how much land he was going to give them at first, because they were going to survive. So they were kind of a cheap and cheerful option. They were a sort of yellow pack monastic option, if you like. And this is what they looked like. What's the name from? Well, first of all, canon regular. A canon is a priest. Regular means a priest who follows a rule, a monastic rule. And the definition of a monastic is somebody who follows a rule, a set of regulations. The set of regulations which the Augustinian canons regular followed was the rule of St. Augustine. The Benedictines followed the rule of St. Benedict. The Cistercians followed the rule of Benedict. The two great rules that they had in the Middle Ages were the rules of Benedict and Augustine. So it was really a case of one or other. Or if you didn't go for those options, you had your derivatives. But they were the two core monastic rules of the medieval church. The Benedictine rule was the stricter of the two. The reason it was strict was Benedict himself wrote the rule. He actually sat down and said, here's what I want monastic observance to be. So he wrote a very strict rule. In contrast, the rule of St. Augustine was far more flexible. It was flexible because St. Augustine, who was one of the intellectual heavyweights of the early church, didn't write a rule. What he did was he wrote letters to people, including to his sister, who was a nun, talking about what he thought monastic observance should be. And it was only in the 11th century that the writings of St. Augustine were sort of cannibalized to make a rule. And because it wasn't in Augustine's own voice, the rule of St. Augustine turned out to be a very flexible thing. Some people went for Augustine's most hard-line views on things, some went for the more sort of touchy-feely, softer approach. It became very diverse. These boys followed the rule of St. Augustine. They're not any less devout than the Cistercians, but theirs was a more flexible rule. And that flexibility, the flexibility of the monastic life, was one of the things that made them attractive. If you had a parish near an Augustinian priory, the Augustinians will find you a priest for it, that type of thing. If you have a hospital, the Augustinians will work the hospital for you. The Cistercians are not so eager to do these things. If you need to provide parochial pastoral care, you need baptisms, burials, the Augustinians will provide parochial functions like baptism for you, the Cistercians won't. So it was a good option. The rule was in Ireland before the invasion. Some doubt about when it exactly arrives, but it arrives certainly sometime in the middle of the 12th century, just before the Anglo-Normans come. Christ Church Cathedral, Lawrence O'Toole, very famous archbishop, we know that he brought Augustinians to Christ Church. They're already in Ireland, probably in very small numbers. I think the numbers have probably been even exaggerated, but we do know the rule is here. Then when the Anglo-Normans come, the Anglo-Normans really promote the rule. And they do it very quickly. Kells Priory in Kilkenny at the end of the 12th century. Another great monastery founded by another great Anglo-Norman lord, founded as an Augustinian monastery. Tristan, County Westmeath, which we'll talk about again in a few minutes, near Mullingar, founded as Augustinian. Ballyboggin, virtually unknown, County Meath, an early one, founded by the local lord. Ballintubber in Mayo. Once the Anglo-Normans arrive and boost the Augustinian order in Ireland, the Gaelic lords who've known about it embrace it. So not only are there new Anglo-Norman foundations, there are also new Gaelic-Irish foundations. Little footnote here, the foundations are going good. They're flying along, and so too are the new Cistercian houses until the mendicants arrive. And they change everything. I'm not going to talk about mendicants today, but when the Franciscans and the Dominicans come to Ireland, they are sexier as ecclesiastics go They insist on poverty. They insist that they will not take anything, that they will beg, they will take alms. They don't want property, they don't want luxurious buildings. All they want to do is look after people, if they're Franciscans, and preach, if they're Dominicans. And the more, it's a bit like Mrs. Doyle and Father Ted, the more they insist that they don't want tea, the more tea they're going to get. And they end up incredibly rich. And the patronage of Augustinian and Cistercian houses begins to dry up. And even here, in a place like this, Athassel, once the mendicants appear in Cashel, for example, they are going to take money which may have been heading for Athassel. A little footnote, by the way, the people who really hated the mendicants were the parish priests. And the reason was that parish priests in the Middle Ages were generally fairly impoverished. They depended on fees they would get for saying masses for their income, kind of like today, the parish Jews. And one of the masses that the parish priest was saying was the burial mass. So priests depended on their parishioners dying, and then the mendicants arrived and they offered the service as well. And parochial clergy across Europe hated the mendicants for it. There's an enormous anti-fraternal, anti-friar sentiment because of this. So once the mendicants come in the 1230s and 1240s, the monastic landscape changes. And I think that is probably a factor in Athassel's own decline a couple of decades later. Athassel is Gothic architecture. I'm going to talk about the appearance of Gothic in Ireland because this is I'm now moving towards what the buildings tell us about Athassel. Athassel is an example of Gothic. This is a type of architecture which first appeared in the Paris Basin in the middle of the 12th century and first made it to England in the 1170s and spread around Europe. By the middle of the 13th century, it's everywhere in Europe. You know it as the architecture of pointed arches, basically. That's how it's often understood. The first Anglo-Normans that came to Ireland with the invasion didn't know anything about Gothic. Gothic only appeared in England about 10 years after the Normans invaded Ireland. So the first settlers had no idea that this new style was coming in. Thereafter, it came into Ireland, but it wasn't here at the beginning. So the very first Anglo-Norman buildings in Ireland are very old-fashioned, and they look very old-fashioned. If they had invaded 10 years later, things would have looked a little bit different. But then it does begin to come in, and when it begins to come in, it very quickly becomes the new fashion. It is a rapid visual transformation. Any church which is not Gothic looks old-fashioned, even if it was recently built. So that's what it is. Let me tell you about its appearance in Ireland. And this is important to understand Athassel in a very general sense before we delve into the building itself. Gothic, when did it first appear? There's been a lot of discussion about this. My own work on this over the past couple of years has absolutely convinced me, I'm certain, that it was St. Thomas's Abbey in Dublin in 1192. The evidence is all circumstantial, and I won't go through it, but I think the very first time anybody in Ireland saw a Gothic building was 1192, when the royal house of St. Thomas's, dedicated to Thomas Becket. You know, the king is trying to weasel his way back into church favour. It's rededicated in 1192, and I think it was rebuilt. It's gone, unfortunately. There are excavations going on at the moment on the site. A good friend of mine is doing the excavations, and he has me on speed dial. Every single stone he finds which looks interesting, I want to see it. And he's got a few interesting stones already. There's no doubt it was, in my mind, it was Gothic. Kells Priory, shortly before 1200. A lot of later building here, but one little part of Kells looks to me to be early Gothic, which suggests that by the year 1200 it was already beginning to percolate out of Dublin into the provinces. You imagine you're a guy like William de Burgh You're going to found a monastery, and you're ready to go, you've got the contracts ready, and somebody rings you up, or whatever they did, and says, there's a new style appearing in Dublin. It's the new rock and roll, everyone's doing it. And what you do, you just hold back and observe. I think that's what happened. So, Kells, just before 1200, they've got masons. They've got some masons who know how this stuff works. Newtown Trim in Meath, outside Trim, this is the best of the early ones. Founded around 1205. This is a fully Gothic cathedral. This is the first Gothic cathedral built in Ireland, and it's still there. And it's a very important room because it's almost certainly modelled on St. Thomas's. So now we're beginning to see a new architecture appearing. Tristana, County Westmeath. This is gone, unfortunately, apart from one wall. I published a book last year at Fort Courts Press on this. It's a fantastic monument. These drawings were done by two great artists in the late 18th century. 3 years later, the landlord demolished it. His neighbours pleaded with him and he said no. So we have these records, but they're very accurate. So I trust them, and that political tower is original. This is Geoffrey de Constantine near Athassel. Around the year 1200 he's already collecting resources, which means he's already founded it, which means he's ready to build. So it's quite elaborate. Already in rural Westmeath, within 10 years of St. Thomas's, Gothic is arriving. So there's a rapid transformation. Ballyboggin, County Meath, around 1200 as well. Much more military, nonetheless Gothic. So here it is. It's percolating out of Dublin within 10 years. And then Christchurch, of course, which is the greatest of all of them. Christchurch was being built in the 1190s, and they stopped. And they didn't pick it up again until 1216. Why did they stop? Because what they were building was old-fashioned. They looked across the rooftops, they saw St. Thomas's and thought, darn. And they stopped, and then they waited, and then they rebuilt in the Gothic style, and you get this incredible piece of Gothic work. So Athassel is in this tradition. Around 1200, this new style has come down into Tipperary as well. So when William de Burgh is going to found Athassel, not only is he getting together the economic resources to keep the priory up and running, he's also getting the masons. I'm inclined more and more to think that the Augustinians are actually critical to the spread of Gothic in Ireland, because the first generation Gothic churches that we have shown here, and you can see there are similarities between them. Athassel at the very top, which is the biggest, Ballyboggin underneath it, which is very, very rude, small and simple, Kells, which was simple but became complex, Newtown Trim, which was simple as well but was huge, and then Tristan at the bottom, which is an incredibly big place and very, very complex. I think actually what we're looking at here is the Gothic Big Bang. The Cistercians are doing it as well. The Cistercians are also building in Gothic, but the Cistercians are Cistercians. So when you go to a Gothic church which is Cistercian, you're more inclined to say, that's a Cistercian church rather than that's a Gothic church. But here, these Augustinian churches, I think, are what introduced the new style to Ireland. And of course, the possibility is, I think probability, is that in some of these cases, the canons in these monasteries are not all Anglo-Normans. I think some of them must be Irish as well. In the case of Tristan at the bottom, for example, I'm pretty sure it was founded after an Irish Augustinian house was destroyed, and half the canons went one direction, half went another direction, and the half that went towards Tristan joined with Anglo-Norman canons and lived in the monastery. So I suspect if we knew who's in these places at the very start, the priors, the abbots are all Anglo-Normans. Of course they are, but the ordinary canons probably have some Irish people in there. Because basically belief in God is overriding the ethnic political differences. So let's talk about the Athassel itself. What does the priory tell us? And this is the last part of my talk, and it's the part that in many ways is the hardest to do, because actually we should just all go down to Athassel and walk around and there I could explain its incredible complexity to you insofar as I'm able to get at its complexity and understand it. It has, as I said, been sort of neglected. It's a national monument, so it's in state care, it's protected, it's been published, there are plans of it, etc., there are descriptions of it, but there's never been a coherent study of it. And when I started last year looking at Athassel and set myself the target of trying to understand it, I began to read all these other people who've written on it, and was really struck by how much disagreement there is. That you know, the likes of Harold Leask and Roger Staley and Michael O'Neill and so on have all commented on it, but none of them agrees with the other. So somebody's wrong, or maybe they're all wrong. So I find that a very useful sort of career move on is just assume what you read is wrong and just see if you can go on it differently. And maybe it's not wrong. But the inconsistencies between the versions of Athassel's architectural history were such that it seemed to me that it needed a fresh run, and a run with a fresh pair of eyes. And I describe very briefly in the paper some of the views that others have on it and how they contradict each other. First of all, let's look at the plan of it. This is just the church. I've taken away the claustral buildings. What I mean by that is I've taken away the cloister, the chapter house, the refectory, all of that sort of stuff. So there's a whole area at the bottom which is being excluded from this graphic. These were the working buildings of the monastery where people lived and did monastic business and so on. I'm dealing really with the church. What happens in the foundation of a monastery is land is given to a monastic community, a labour force is assembled, and the site is laid out. They decide the scale of the building that they're going to have. When they decide the scale of the church, they decide the scale of the cloister. So it's all worked out in advance. It's not worked out on parchment like an architect would. It's often marked out on the ground. There's a certain amount of sort of guesswork and so on, and lining things up, which I'll show you in a second because it's important. But then when building begins, it was not unusual to begin with wooden structures, temporary wooden structures. This is very, very common actually in monastic houses. As soon as they get on site, they want to start praying. So they need a church, so they build a wooden church, and then they start replacing it gradually in stone. I suspect here they didn't have a wooden church. I think they just went straight into the stone architecture. And they would have started at the east end, over towards me. North is always at the top. These churches they're basically machines. I mean, once you know how they work, you know how they work. You can go anywhere in Europe to a medieval church, and it's so easy to understand. Unlike a modern church, you didn't sit, you stood. A lot of movement. Unlike a modern church, there are partitions. Modern churches don't have partitions. This is very much a post-Vatican II thing, but even before then it was happening. The partitions are taken down. You know, it used to be the case that the altars at the back of the church, and the priest stood with his back to the congregation, so that the consecration went on invisible. And then, of course, the altars got brought forward. The priest turned around. The altar rail lowered. Sometimes it got rid of a ridge completely. You know, instead of kneeling at the altar rail to get communion, you stand on a little step. So, you know, it's been opened up. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't opened up, it was closed down. There's a whole series of screens. There's one screen here that you can see right in the middle of the church, but there are other screens missing as well. And as you head from the right towards the left, you're going down in social class, okay? So the canons, the community, the prior, the patron will all be up at the top end on the right-hand side. The local people, if they're in it at all, which they were, would be down on the left-hand side. It's a transeptal church. What that means is it has transepts, it's cross-shaped. Those transepts are very interesting in Athassel. They're very curious. I could just talk about those on their own for an hour, but I won't. Because transepts were actually conventionally part of the circulation. If you think of a modern church, If you go to the side aisle, what's called the side aisle, well actually often these things today are called the aisles, and they shouldn't be called aisles, they're transepts. But you can walk from the end of the church into the transept. So you can go to the side of the altar, and that was the normal. In Athassel you couldn't. And it's one of the mysteries of Athassel. I think I know why, but I'm not certain on that. I mean, excavation might answer that. But if you look, there are walls. Here, for example, that shouldn't have a wall. That should be open, and yet it's not. It's as if they built the right-hand side, finished it, and then tacked on the rest of the building. And in fact, that's kind of what they did do. The altar is always going to be up here, at this end, under the east window, a little bit out from the wall. Between there and the middle of the church, the space that's marked by the windows is where you get the choir, the stalls. It's called the choir because they sang Mass. So there's constant singing going on inside these churches. And then, as I said, the far end, on the left-hand side, is the place where ordinary people go in. The building history of this is very complex, it's also very peculiar. There are some things in there which I've simply never seen in buildings anywhere before. I've been in a lot of buildings, I just haven't seen this sort of thing. But I'll try to give you the basic of the history for the next 15 minutes or so, and then we can take questions. First of all, when you enter the monastery, on the way in you go through a monastic gate. And there's my little girl, and whenever she goes on field work with me, she ends up as a scale because she just won't get out of my pictures, you know. So just move a little bit over, and you know, she jumps out at the last moment. But there's a little gateway. You see the vaulting and so on. So there's a moment of entry into the monastic enclosure. I suspect there's probably a chapel upstairs. Gateway chapels were quite common. So God is protecting the gateway. God is watching whoever enters and whoever leaves. So these gate buildings are often quite complex things, and they may sometimes even contain accommodation for visitors. And then you walk from the gateway towards the great front of the priory, and what a front this must have been. This is a fantastic piece of architecture. It's very battered today. Originally, I'll just go back for a moment. When you walked towards it, it was quite asymmetrical. There was a tower sticking out of the corner, which was a bell tower. There was a very tall tower dominating the facade. It's interesting and important that it's there because Athassel must have had bells. The only other place for bell ringing would have been what we call the crossing, the tower right in the middle. If Athassel has a tower on that corner, it means the tower in the middle didn't have bells. That's the bell tower. And the knowledge that the tower in the middle wasn't needed for bells is very useful for reconstructing the building's history. So anyway, here's the front of it. And great entrance, doorway now gone. I think the doorway is almost certainly relocated further in, which I'll show you in a few minutes. The arch back there, which is now at the east end of the building, I think was originally the entrance doorway and was relocated. And relocated possibly in the 14th century after the place is attacked. But I think you have to imagine this is a very, very tall front. This is a very powerful facade facing out to the world. Here's the detail of it. You can see the quality of the stonework. Here's a typical Gothic window, a pointed window, we call it a lancet. The date of this facade has been one of the things most disputed. My colleagues have different views on it. I'm going to tell you my view of it in just a moment. But you can see the quality of the stonework, and I think this is extremely important in understanding where the building of this front fits within the history of the building. And here is the key evidence. What's that red line? That red line is actually nothing, but it is showing you the perpendicular axis of the building. Okay? It's at a right angle to the long axis of the church. And if you look at the west wall, to the left of it, you can see it's slightly offline. Okay? In other words, it is leaning from here away. It's very negligible. You can only see it in the plan, but it's there. And when I was there, I did some measurements to see if I could see it, and yes, it's there. There's no doubt about it. It's leaning slightly. That has in recent years been identified and interpreted. I think it's been misinterpreted. The view is, or has been up to maybe next month, if I can convince people, that what happened was they started building at this end. They keep building towards the west, which is quite normal. There's a break, and then they build on the facade, and there's a little break in the masonry at either end to indicate that that wall on the left-hand side is of a different date than the walls in the middle. So the conventional view is that they stop, there's a gap, and then they build on. I think actually it's the opposite. I think what happened was they started at this end, as I'll show you in a minute, which is where they should always start, because you need the altar, you get going with Mass. Then they determined the length of their church. Then they built the west wall of the church so that when you crossed the field, across the precinct towards the church, you saw the facade, but there was nothing behind it at first. Then they went and built the in-between. And the reason that wall drifts or splays is they hadn't built the rest of it, so they were calculating the alignment. They were trying to get it parallel and perpendicular to the bit which they had built. They nearly got it right, but they didn't quite get it right. So what happens in Athassel is they start at the east end, they decide how long the church is going to be, they go to the west end and they build that great screen, and once they've got that in place, they then return to the east end and they build their way down towards the front of the church which they've already constructed. And this is the end where they begin, the east end. And this is unbelievably complex, and really what this needs is a more detailed survey than I have, or than has ever been done, to work out some of the problems of it. But basically, when you are inside the church looking towards the east end, this is what you see. This is William de Burgh, circa 1200. The window in the east wall at the moment is a late medieval replacement. It was quite common in the late Middle Ages, in the 15th century, to get rid of the big windows that they originally had and go for smaller windows. And if you go to Athassel and look very carefully, you can see where the original window has been filled in and a smaller one made. The little niches or arched cavities on the left and the right are original. This is William de Burgh. They are statue niches, which raises the possibility that one of them had a statue of the BVM, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the other was the statue of Edmund with his lance, ready to throw it. A statue with a lance doesn't make sense. I suspect these were painted panels. But these are original. The altar is original, that's where it was, and the side walls are original, and originally they had choir stalls against them, with the senior members of the community sitting at the back, junior ones at the front. This is a very primitive piece of Gothic architecture. There's no vaulting, it had a timber roof. It was later replaced, but it was always timber. So this is not very high quality architecture, it has to be said. It's good, but it's not great. This is where they started. And I suspect there are probably resourcing problems at the very beginning, because by the time they get around to the transepts, working from east to west, the architecture is getting more complex. And in fact, here is part of the south transept, and this is very Cistercian. If you didn't know where this was, you would, if if for some reason I had not been to Athassel for years and you flashed this in front of me and said, where is that? I'd start going through my little sort of, my little index of Cistercian abbeys, thinking, could that be, etc., etc. This is very Cistercian. That might be relevant because the Cistercians are also building in Gothic. It may be that the Athassel community or the Athassel patron drew on Cistercian expertise to bring the building on a little bit. But it's getting more complex. It's taking root, the money is coming in, the resources have been put in place, they have the ambition, they're now beginning to match the ambition with very elaborate architecture. Then, as I say, that whole east end is constructed, and I think it's probably finished in the 1210s, maybe about 1220. Then they go down to the west end and they build the front, the screen, so that the church has both ends done like a sandwich. Would that be unusual? No, it wouldn't, actually. That's not unusual at all. I've only just thought of, I wish I'd brought an example of it, but the very first Gothic building in France, true Gothic building in France, is the Abbey of Saint-Denis outside Paris. And Saint-Denis was an old church, and the Abbot of Saint-Denis, a man called Abbot Suger, he had the east end built, or he replaced the east end of the old church. Then he replaced the west end of the old church. And the east end of the old church was this enormous soaring Gothic structure. The west end was an enormous soaring Gothic structure, and the bit in the middle was a little strip of a building. Almost like a set of goalposts, with huge front, huge back, and nothing in the middle until that eventually was replaced. So Saint-Denis is an example of a great church where they begin on the right, they go to the left, and then they put in the middle. That's exactly what they did at Athassel. And as I say, the reason they do it is they know it's going to take them time to finish the church, but they want the church to have a front wall. The nave, when they got around to the nave, they built something really very, very weird. The supports are gone. The side aisle supports, these piers, they've all gone. So we'd like to see those. An excavation would be very interesting there, because I suggested in the article one possible explanation, which can only be proved by excavation. So it'd be fun to see. Am I right? But anyway, sorry, hang on. Yeah. You saw her again. She's in another picture. She's posing. Little girls pose. Pictures end up for me on lectures, for her on Instagram. It's a strange world. This is the nave, looking from the crossing back down towards the wall, front wall. So these are the bits that they filled in afterwards, and the piers in the middle are all gone. So it's quite a wide church. The centre of it was timber roofed, but there it is. The side aisles were vaulted. It was very, very strange. The side aisles were vaulted. So if I go back, the middle vessel, the wide part, which is the important part in a sense, is timber. The side had vaulting. Vaulting is money. Vaulted churches were rare in Ireland. The presence of vaulting in Athassel puts it in the Premier League. So it's a very important church from that point of view. But why didn't they vault the middle of the church? And what I've suggested is one possibility. I don't believe it, but I thought I should mention it in the article because excavation may show it to be the case. One possibility is in the middle aisle, the central church was vaulted and it collapsed, and then they replaced it in timber. And that if we found the original piers there, we would have the evidence on the piers. But anyway, whatever's going on here, the side aisles had vaulting. And you say, how do you know it had vaulting? Well, you can see the scars. You can see this upright here, which then goes out like a sort of palm tree. So these were vaulted. So you walked along these, you circulated along these until you got towards the east end, when, curiously, you're walking along here, under a vault, and bang, hit a wall. You shouldn't hit a wall, you should be able to walk through. Here and over there. This is strange. Is it original? Could it have been blocked? It could, but I don't think it was. I think it is original. I think the aisles literally stopped at the crossing, and I can't think of another church where I've seen this, but I've mulled over this, and I think that blocking is original. I really don't know why it is. What I would say to you is that there was certainly an altar here. When you got, let's go back for a moment. When you got to the end of the aisle and couldn't go through, there was an altar, and at the far side as well. So you are, in a sense, coming to the end of a liturgical space. So by not having the passage going through into the transepts, you create a space for ancillary altars. And you can imagine an altar dedicated to, St. Edmund, one to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and so on. So it worked, I suppose. It had a function, but it was unusual. This is not normally what they did. Of course, the great mystery of Athassel is this, and this is what I want to finish on. What I've given you very simply is a very simple version of what I think the history of the building is. To repeat, start at the east end, they get so far, they go down to the west end, they build the facade, and then they fill in the gap in between. They start at the east end around 1200, they build the wall at the west end of the church in the 1210s, and then in the 1220s and 1230s, they finish the church. So what do we make of this? This is the great crossing tower. This is the singular most difficult and inscrutable part of Athassel's architecture, the one that nobody agrees on because nobody will talk about it. It has been pretty much sort of abandoned as well, that's weird, let's not worry about it, It's crying out for an analysis, a stone-by-stone recording, but I think we can see enough in there to say exactly what's going on here. That wall that you see there is not original. It's a rebuilding. You can see evidence of what the original end of the middle of the church looked like. This is all built afterwards. I think it's built in the 14th century. I think it's built sometime between the attack on the monastery and those records of St. Edmund with his lance, somewhere in the early 14th century. What they did was they took the original doorway out of the facade and they moved it down here. So this is the original doorway which has been relocated. And in relocating the door here, they are effectively giving up the church. The church is now roofless. It has effectively been abandoned. The new church of Athassel starts there. Okay? When you enter through here, you're into the choir, it's the main part of the church. A couple of windows here, a couple of windows at the top, and then this great gallery overhead, which has been filled in. And then above that, a tower, and with the ogee windows and so on. When you stand inside the choir and look back up, now standing looking in the direction of the main front of the church through the window, and you look at the tower, the crossing tower, which is where the two lines of the church meet, something really weird happens here. And Stanley spotted this, didn't have an explanation. I've spotted it, I don't have an explanation either. I've never seen it anywhere in any building I've ever been in. And it's this. This is part of the original crossing, support of one of the arches. So it's 13th century. So is this. And there are two more hidden at the back. Insofar as we can tell, they've all got different profiles. If you cut a slice through them like a piece of Blackpool rock, each of them's got a different legend, okay? Also, the floor level is different. The one on the right is higher than the one on the left. And yet it seems to be in the right place. So neither Roger nor myself have an explanation for that. It is what you see. My sense is that you go the simplest route here. In the absence of an explanation for why that might be, let's just take it that that's what they intended. Those supports are important because it shows us that having started behind me, okay, with a very plain east end, as they're heading towards the west, money is coming in, expertise is coming in, the church is getting very elaborate very quickly. I suspect at some stage they intended to go back and modernise where the altar was and they just didn't do it. Anyway, and then you get to that wall that you see at the back, which is basically this from the other side. And what you see here is a very complex piece of architecture, but what I will just draw your attention to is above the opening there's a horizontal line. Can you see that? Now that's very important, okay? Because when you measure the building, and there's a lot of evidence I can't show you here, it's quite clear that this was a floored area. Okay? So there's a floor missing, which means when you go up this side, that big arch, if you take out the blocking stone, that arch is open, and if you climbed up into the arch, you come out on the floor. When you're standing in here and look up, there's the floor above you. When you're inside the arch, there's the floor below you. So there's like a platform inside the building. What is the function of that arch? That is for a rood. A rood was a hanging crucifix at times of the year. It was revealed when the curtains were pulled back. It was the crucifix that was associated with the entrance into the sanctuary of the church. A rood is a cross, basically. Sometimes roods were small and could be suspended from the ceiling on chains. Sometimes they were big and they stood as if they're monumental crosses, like the type of cross that you get in front of a monastery in the 19th century. This is a rood loft. It's a room with a floor for the display of the rood. And the drawing I'm going to show you next is from the publication, and there's a lot in it, so just bear with me. A series of reconstruction drawings I did. The top drawing shows you a reconstruction of what the end of the church was like, superimposed on a photograph. The second one down shows you the rood back in position. I've emptied out the infill and I've put in the little cross, as you can see. The cross is on a beam, which is quite common. Left and right are two figures, John the Baptist and Mary, often the case, and underneath is a little gallery with a priest talking, preaching out into the body of the church. This is a classic rood screen. And left and right, just go back for a second, see that cavity there on the far side? Left and right were small little niches, and I suspect what has happened here, I could be wrong, is that the original statues or paintings of Blessed Virgin Mary and St. Edmund, which had been at the back wall, were now brought out into these spaces. These are like statue display cases. The construction of this great rood screen can be dated to the 14th century. Ironically, as the church is being allowed to fall into decay because they don't have much money, they replaced the body of the church with this great new front. And they relocate the door and they construct a new rood loft for it. This is a piece of very sophisticated liturgical architecture. One of the issues that has always been a problem, look away, that's a great picture. One of the issues that has always puzzled people is the relationship between all of this stuff down here at the top of the tower, because the top of the tower looks to be later. Well, it's all about using your eye. If you look carefully enough, you can see exactly what has gone on. At a certain stage, this is in disrepair, and there's a line of stonework you can see where they simply added a new tower onto the top of it. And my guess is that the tower that we see here belongs to the lay administrator. the guy who takes over in the 1480s, this looks like a 15th century tower to me, this is his residence. So we've got multiple phases in this. So what I'm suggesting then is that in the 14th century, there's this remarkable and, to my knowledge, unparalleled reinvention of Athassel. The church is ruined, there isn't money to replace it, so they leave it like an open court, the nave, and they concentrate on the far end of the church. They turn what was originally a big arch into a screen. What was originally a big chancel arch, they make smaller and they move the doorway down. Originally, there may have been a rood, we don't know, but now they've given it a proper rood screen with a crucifix on a beam and a gallery for the priest. This is a classic piece of high medieval liturgical architecture. It's got 3 zones, if you think about it. The bottom zone is where we walk through. The middle zone is the preaching zone, and the top zone is where the rood is. We have, from the early 14th century, a seal preserved in England. And I think the seal is the rood screen. This is a seal of the prior of Athassel from the 1330s. We've got 2 seals, this is the better of the 2. We know it's an Athassel seal because it's attached to a letter of the prior, so it has come from Athassel. What do you have? You have an arch underneath with a praying figure, I think possibly St. Edmund. Above that, you've got the Blessed Virgin Mary, and above that, you've got the crucifix, you've got the rood. And what this is, and it's all within a frame, what this is basically is the seal depicting the rood screen of Athassel. So it's a unique example of a piece of seal art lining up with a building. To conclude, what I've given you today is a sense that Athassel is a very frustrating place because we don't have enough history, but that we can fill in the history with the archaeology. My hypothesis needs testing, and detailed survey will test it, and there's more to it than I've given you. But it does look very much, to my mind, as if we're looking at a very early Gothic foundation, which starts modestly, quickly becomes very wealthy, very elaborate. At a certain stage early on in its history, as it's getting bigger, they take the unusual step of building the front wall with nothing behind it. They eventually fill it in. By the 1220s, it is more or less complete. It continues on through the 1200s. In 1327, the Earl of Ulster is buried here, so it's clearly still a viable place. But by the middle of the 14th century, it's clearly in trouble. My suspicion is that the re-edification of the front of the East End, this is actually done by the Earl of Ulster. And that it's through that doorway, shortly after it's finished, with the paint still smelling, as Mary McAleese used to say, or Mary Robinson, what I remember my presidency is the smell of fresh paint. That the paint is still fresh when the Earl of Ulster is brought in. I think we're looking not only at a piece of remarkable liturgical architecture, we're looking at the patronage of the Earl of Ulster. And then, shortly afterwards, it can't be sustained. The 14th century is too poor, the mendicants are up in Cashel, they're hoovering up all the money, and then of course there's local trouble, the place is going to be attacked, and by the time you get to the late 15th century, half a century out from Henry VIII, the place is already virtually dead. And when it gets a lay administrator appointed, that's a sign that there's nothing happening here. The canons are not even here anymore, they're somewhere else, they're living in houses locally. The great miracle of Athassel is having fallen into disuse and disrepair so quickly that it wasn't all broken down and carted away for stone, because that could very easily have happened. So what we're left with is a marvellous, marvellous monument, which I think we're now beginning to understand. And with every phase of understanding, I think it just gets more marvellous. Okay? Thank you very much.
particularly, I know we have a few golden people here, so maybe some of them would like to ask something. Anybody like
So I
to?
just make the point that we're looking at the main entrance. That
Yeah.
was replicated in the parish church in Tipperary town, the main entrance.
Really?
Not that, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
You
Yeah.
can't see it because they put the native porch in.
Sure, yeah.
Into the porch.
Yeah.
The entrance.
So Tipperary town has appropriated Athassel. It's not really theirs, they get their own one. Or is that actually a mean thing to say?
But it's exactly the same as that.
That's very interesting.
Now, what about the place name itself? Would you have any explanation?
Yeah.
I don't know actually, and funny, when I showed the slide with the Latin, I remembered that I meant to reread that because I'd read it once before, and I don't recall at all. I saw something about it, and I've blanked on it. I blanked on it when I was standing here, and I was hoping nobody would notice because I was dying to say something. Do you know? Is there
The moat, the moat remnants of it,
Yeah. Okay.
which was there long before.
Yes. It's a pre-invasion name. All the names are pre-invasion. That's the thing, you know. I'm sorry.
Low forward or lower.
Is that what it is?
And that's
I
the
got
only-
low.
one of the most affordable parts
It's
of
got
the
low.
shoe.
Yeah.
And the only I've seen heights of the front.
Really?
Across the shoe.
My God.
By the shoe road.
Yeah.
Leading right across to where presumably I told Margaret some years ago that I struck notice. And the marsh is still there covered in.
Yes.
Across the river.
Across the river. Yes. That's right. The original castle's across the river. I've never been able to see it, but I've seen it on the map.
There's a female architect in Clonmel who's done the restoration.
That's right. Margaret Quinlan.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Quinlan. Yeah. And Dr. Tadhg is her husband.
Well,
Yeah.
he'd her marvellous research there. Well, wasn't certainly promised because it wasn't her position to promise, but there was a potential to partially restore. You'd never restore a place like that because too much to even consider. But I mean, for just to do something to not let it deteriorate any further. That's my own words now.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about any plan?
No, I know there's a conservation plan for it.
Yeah, conservation plan.
Yeah, and I know the conservation plan was done and so on. And conservation is what you do here. Restoration is fine if you can be certain of what you're restoring. You wouldn't be certain here. There are missing phases, clearly. I think it would be very interesting intellectual exercise to think about how it would be restored, because that would be useful from the point of view of understanding it. But I wouldn't, you could re-roof Cashel Cathedral easily enough. People talk about that in the past because that's all there. But this type of place, the danger, it's a bit like the wall at Newgrange, that once you restore it, you deprive the next generation of the opportunity to go back and rethink it. And we could all be mad wrong. And in 20 years' time, there may be some technique for dating those stones, which, if we've covered it up with cement, it's gone. So I'm not in favour of restoration unless you can be 100% certain. You can't even be 5% certain here.
Can I add a little bit before other people want to get in? Apart from that, there was only one grass, just as a matter of interest now, for botany. I'd have a great interest in that area. And a single grass was recorded as being reasonably rare. That was the biggest lie. That part of that was told about that. Anyhow, would you consider that when they came across Europe, all of the Augustinians, Benedictines, the whole lot of them, they brought new knowledge that's still not understood, from animal husbandry to the medicinal and culinary values of plants that led on to the doctrine of
Absolutely.
doctrine of signature.
Yeah, they're absolutely right, yes. They're knowledgeable people.
Yeah, but there has been found since around the most particular area, the remnants of that, some very rare plants with medicinal and culinary values, which would tie in with their knowledge at that time.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting.
Have you any explanation for the arrow loops in the tower?
For the windows.
Not that tower, the tower on the north.
Oh, the northwest corner. I'm all suspicious of arrow loops. I don't think it's a defensive tower. I mean, it serves to protect the entrance, but it's as much symbolic as anything else. And the thickness of the walls is because it's going to be a very tall building. So it appropriates the architecture of contemporary castle building, but there's nothing military at all about Athassel. Compared to, say, a place like Ballybogan, which I showed you, which is very grim, you can imagine the cannons racing in and knocking the door when they're in trouble, and you can imagine them needing arrow loops. Here, this sort of architecture are clearly very, very safe, and any visitor who comes that they don't want will be deterred by the sight of arrow loops, never actually be shot at, I suspect.
Archstyle, and then seeing the window, the western window, in particular region. Beautiful.
Yes, yes.
Completely disappeared between 1760 and 1840 when the London came.
Yeah, and you know, I wondered before about this because I've wondered elsewhere, and it doesn't seem to be the case, but you'd never know. Is it in the church somewhere? I know the window of the Dominican friary in Glanworth ended up in the local Protestant church, and looked like a modern window until people looked at it and realised it's medieval carving. You know, this is a very rural place, so I don't know whether there's any church which could have some stuff. But those windows are you know, they're very easily reassembled somewhere, and that's the sort of date which. The problem with Archictural is that he's very handy. We just wish sometimes he would tell us a little bit more.